Business over drinks. Business over drinks. This is Dave and Tom. This is Business over drinks.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Business Over Drinks. My name is Tung and I'm calling in from Singapore.
Hello everyone, my name is David and I'm calling in from Brisbane. And today we've got a special episode. So this episode, we're talking about something that's been bothering a lot of us lately. That is the topic of Facebook and Google versus the government and major news outlets. If you haven't heard lately, there was a standoff between Google and the Australian government, to which Google seems to have eventually backed down, followed by Facebook and the Australian government, to which Facebook didn't back down, but then sort of did after a while. Are you confused yet? I am. I'm confused all the time. But what does this mean? And especially, what does this mean for you guys, not only in Australia, but who are listening from around the world? Well, before Tung and I started ranting about a topic we know Jack all about, we thought we'd bring an actual smart person on the show. So we're very excited to introduce to you our next guest, who's Mathew Ingram. So Mathew Ingram is an award-winning journalist who has spent the past 2 decades writing about business, technology, and new media, as well as advising media companies on digital strategy. He's currently the chief digital writer for the Columbia Journalism Review. And prior to that, he was a senior writer with Fortune magazine, where he wrote about the evolution of media and the internet. Before joining Fortune, he had a similar position at Gigaom, hopefully I pronounced that right, Gigaom, a leading technology blog network. You can follow Mathew on Twitter at Mathewi, to which he has about 89,500 followers. I have about 300, so well done to that. So welcome to the show, Mathew. Thank you so much for coming on board.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Before we start, what's everyone drinking?
Yeah.
I just finished a cup of coffee because it's 9 a.m. here. So.
Yeah.
It's a little different here in Singapore. It's 10 p.m. So I'm having Australian gin, actually, a 4 Pillars, the 4 Pillars gin that we got from Gin Loot. So I'm quite excited about that. I've been drinking that for a while. So while it's not new, it's definitely exciting for me. Dave, what about you, man?
I remember buying you 4 Pillars in the airport. I think I bought you twice now coming into Singapore. It's one of your favorite gins, isn't it? Or is that a different drink that I'll get you?
You got me a different. It's 4 Pillars, but it's a different gin. Mathew, I want to apologize. Dave's gonna go on a round about how he buys me things, so I apologize.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm Tung's sugar daddy. I don't know if that's the right term. I don't know. Anyway, so what I am drinking is a Paul Tom's Distillery dried gin, courtesy of your sponsors Liquor Loot as well, Sydney Dry. And it's got a nice kind of citrusy taste, and I'm enjoying it. Well, shout out to Sydney Gins. Well done. So let's get on with it.
Yeah. So Mathew, I mean, we've kind of got to start right at the beginning, right? So maybe you can just tell us a little bit more, because I know that it's changing all the time, but maybe tell us a little bit more about what's going on with the Australian government, Facebook, and Google.
Sure. So Australia proposed a new law. I guess they started talking about it a year or so ago, and it just passed actually yesterday. So while they were talking about it, it became obvious that they were going to try to force Google and Facebook to pay news publishers for news content on their platforms. So force them to pay. The original version of the law would have forced them to pay anytime someone shared a news link. So anytime there was sort of a quote or a clip from a news story and a link, they would have had to pay for that. And the Australian law is basically a variant of a law that exists in France, in Germany, and a couple of other countries. The EU passed new copyright legislation a year or two ago, and it's been sort of trickling down to EU member countries who have come up with their own versions, but the idea is the same. The idea is Google and Facebook use a lot of news. They control the digital advertising industry. They should pay money to news companies. So Australia came up with this proposed law. Google's response, Google and Facebook took very different approaches. Google's response was, okay, we'll just start cutting deals with publishers. So they've cut a bunch of, multi-million-dollar deals with News Corp and 7 and 9, a couple of big broadcast networks. And Facebook took the exact opposite approach, which was to cut off the country completely, to not only prevent Australian news organizations from posting their content, but to prevent Australians as a whole from posting any news of any kind, not just Australian news, but links to news from any publisher in the world. And so that obviously got a lot of people's attention. And they got a couple of amendments, which we can go into if you want, to the Australian law that made them back down, and they dropped the ban. So that's where we are now.
Yeah, love to go into those laws, but first, is there like a hidden agenda? Do you think there's a bit of a conspiracy theory as to why this is happening? Is it complete? Is the government doing it, for the right reasons? What are your thoughts about all of this?
That's a great question. So, yeah, I don't think I would describe it as a conspiracy theory, but there is a theory that this is Rupert Murdoch's doing, that his sort of hand is the unseen, puppet master, as he likes to be. He controls a vast quantity of Australian media, in fact, British media and media in lots of other places. And so he has been consistent since, I think, about 2009 was the first time he started talking about it, that Google in particular steals content from publishers and that it should pay for it. So he's been at this for, a decade or so. And he also clearly has pretty strong ties to the Australian government. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that this law, which resulted in massive payments to Murdoch companies, came about.
Yeah. Kind of like, so you think he was the hand behind everything, like the puppet master behind everything, or potentially could be?
It feels that way.
Okay, wow, this got a little bit deeper. I wasn't even thinking there. I wasn't even thinking of going there. Damn, that just makes most of our other questions kind of not important anymore.
well, feel free to ask them anyway.
No, that's interesting, right? I just want to touch on that sort of Rupert Murdoch thing a little bit more, because if he's doing this, right, then what about the kind of the independents, the smaller guys? Because I don't think he cares about them at all.
And do they even get paid anything?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, from a sort of, let's assume that the government had kind of the right motivation, that it wanted to support the media, wanted to support journalism. Is this accomplishing that? So I think you could argue that it's not. It's supporting massive existing established media companies that probably have lots of money and don't really need that much more. And it isn't really supporting smaller players who don't have a lot of money and probably do need it, because they're not big enough for Google or Facebook to care about them. And so, they could probably make noise and say, hey, what about us? And wave in the background and send nasty emails to the minister or whatever. But is that going to result in a big check from Google and Facebook? Probably not.
I'm guessing if Mr. Murdoch sends an email, then there will be a big fuss about it.
And that's been one of the kind of big criticisms of this law, is apart from how it kind of screws up the internet by forcing people to pay just for linking to things, which seems wrong. The idea of it just benefiting Rupert Murdoch seems also wrong. I mean, he's a billionaire. He's got more money than God. He doesn't need, hundreds of millions of dollars more from Google and Facebook, I don't think.
Sorry to cut you off on this one, but I thought I'd thread on what you just said, Matthew. In your recent article in the Columbia Journalism Review, you said, I think you shared a quote from someone about how why doesn't the government just tax Google and Facebook accordingly in an appropriate manner to help pay for media companies? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the points that people have made. So there are obviously people in different categories when it comes to this law. Some just think the tech companies are not to blame for what happened to media. Yes, they control digital advertising, but that's because they have a better product. Media companies are just buggy whip makers, and they should, either adapt or die. So that's kind of one extreme. But if you believe that media and journalism have value, social value, they are struggling financially. So maybe as a government, you would think, yes, we should support them somehow. But is this the best way to support them? It particularly isn't for smaller independent players. Whereas if Google cuts a big check to somebody, maybe that's it. Maybe there's no sort of ongoing funding. And so if what you want is kind of consistent funding for all media outlets and journalism, then you would probably come up with a different system. You wouldn't kind of reverse engineer or structure this kind of Rube Goldberg style copyright thing. You would just say, look, we're going to tax digital advertising, or we're going to tax, giant internet companies, whatever kind of, however you want to define who you're taxing, and then take that revenue and create a structure, maybe create public media entities like the BBC, or maybe create trusts that kind of dole money out to all sorts of media companies. You probably wouldn't choose this specific structure.
Yep.
That's interesting. I mean, taxation is often seen as the best way to kind of fuel the economy, do a lot of different things. I think the US hates taxation in general, but let's not get into that conversation. And thanks for cutting me off, Dave. I had a really good question, and now I can't remember what it is. Okay, so that's interesting, right? So, but then, do you think there's any merit to what people have been saying that Facebook and Google are actually kind of maybe not responsible, but are part of the reason for the decline of news media? Is there any merit to that statement at all?
I mean, obviously, they're connected. I mean, the problem is it's a large, complex system, the media and sort of information ecosystem, and it's been transformed, obviously, by the internet. And so part of that transformation is that existing sort of traditional media entities that used to have geographic monopolies or effective monopolies, content-based monopolies, in some cases government legislative monopolies on information, lost all of that. And, you guys don't have to get a government license, I don't think, to do a podcast. People can set up Substacks and tweet and write blog posts and do whatever they want. You can create a media entity out of nothing. And obviously digital advertising has gone through the same transformation. And so Google and Facebook did not have existing media properties that they had to protect or that they had to kind of fund. They were just able to just do this new thing, solely that. And so obviously that makes you more efficient. Whereas traditional media entities have been busy for the last 10, 20 years protecting kind of their existing businesses. And that's, a big part of the kind of Schumpeterian, like Clay Christensen disruption effect. I mean, typically existing entities don't adapt as quickly as new ones, and for a whole bunch of reasons. So that's happened to media companies. Newspapers in particular were already losing audience, and as a result, advertising before the internet came along. So that just accelerated their decline, if you will. So it's been kind of a multi-causal problem. It's not as if you can just say Google and so a lot of people want to say Google and Facebook took $40 billion from media companies, the end. That's what happened, which obviously is ridiculously simplistic and doesn't really describe what actually happened.
Well, I'm kind of in agreement with that as well. I probably don't know half as much as you do, but I feel as though it's like Google is a big mansion, right? And and for some reason he says, you can stay at my place for free. You can benefit from it. You can foster from it. And then one day, the people who are inhabiting this mansion for free suddenly start asking the mansion owner or Google for money, even though they essentially had an awesome vehicle to promote their company, to promote their work and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And in fact, there are some, like Ben Thompson, who writes a newsletter called Stratechery, who says, if you look at it in strictly economic terms, you could argue that media companies should be paying Google and Facebook, not the opposite, because they provide content and get traffic and reach and audience and clicks and all stuff that they theoretically should be able to monetize. That has value. So, for example, Facebook, after it cut off news in Australia, some Australian outlets lost about 20% of their traffic. So clearly Facebook is providing some value. So their argument is kind of, we're already giving you what should be millions of dollars worth of value. Why should we give you cash on top of that?
Fair point. Fair point. I guess we're on the side of the big business right now. Yes.
That's the hard part. Google and Facebook are massive companies with more money than you can possibly imagine. And so I think a lot of media, like traditional media companies, are like, look, we have nothing. You have, more money than we could possibly imagine.
Actually, do you mind if we take
things out of it?
Hey, sorry, Matthew. Sorry to cut you off. Do you mind if we take a step back real quick? Because I think when you mentioned about the Rupert Murdoch thing, right? One thing that kind of struck me, that's the question I wanted to ask earlier, was in your latest article that you wrote, we'll link to it in our show notes as well, was that you mentioned that this type of legislation is not new, but it's happened in other countries. Spain, I believe, was one of the first, and then European countries pretty much kind of took up the similar type of legislation, right? Mm-hmm. So was it the same thing as well, where they were just only the major publishers were going to benefit? Or was there like a hand behind that as well, or was that more for holistic publishing industry level thing?
So my sense of it is, I don't know those countries as well as I do the US, but my sense is that there hasn't been, in some cases, a single actor like Rupert Murdoch. Nobody really controls as much media as Rupert Murdoch does. In Germany, there is a large media entity called Axel Springer, and they have definitely been pushing this type of legislation. They were one of the first ones, sort of after Spain, to try it, and Axel Springer actually removed itself from Google News in sort of protest because Google wasn't abiding by the new law. And Axel Springer saw a drop in traffic of like 30%, and they quite quickly put themselves back in Google News. And so to answer one of your questions, I don't get the sense that in any of these countries, the money has flowed to every media outlet. It's primarily been the big ones that everybody can think of. And certainly as Google has gone around, Google's now talking about paying media companies in Spain because they're going to update their law as well. And so Google basically runs down the list of names that everybody would know from those countries and just cuts them a check.
There's
and one thing I should mention,
sorry, go ahead.
When we were talking about how this all functions, there is a quite easy way for media companies to prevent Google and Facebook from taking their content. In Google's case, they follow what's called a robots.txt file. It's literally a text file on your website. If you put in no Google, they don't crawl your website and they don't index your content. So media companies could do that if they wanted to, but obviously they don't want to because they get a lot of value out of it.
You're absolutely right. That's actually a really good comeback for some debates. But there is an argument that Google News, right, that they are unrightly taking in news articles from websites. Is there any validity to that, in your opinion?
So that quite quickly gets into kind of copyright, the weeds of copyright. So we could do multiple shows just on what is the purpose of copyright and does it serve the purposes that it was supposed to, or is it just a tool that companies use to crush the little guy who's trying to use some of their content? So
Yep.
I believe in all Commonwealth countries, including Australia, there's a concept called fair dealing. In the US, it's called fair use.
Yep.
And the idea is that if you or I decide to take a quote from a newspaper article, we shouldn't have to pay for that. If a teacher uses a paragraph from something as a teaching tool, they shouldn't have to pay for that. And which is easy, you and I can agree, oh, sure, that makes sense. And where it gets complicated is in things like, say, rap music, or, if a DJ takes like little snippets of things and makes a new thing, do they have to pay for every single snippet? Or is that fair use? And Google, for about the last probably 20 years, has been fighting in a variety of ways to kind of uphold fair use because it benefits from that. Google News takes tiny chunks of articles and links to them. That's the same thing I do when I write a blog post. I don't have to pay, so should Google have to pay? And at some point, people will argue, well, Google's so huge and it takes so much that yes, it should pay. And that inevitably winds up in court. They went through a massive lawsuit involving Google Books where they were scanning books and putting them online, and they eventually lost. But there were a number of courts who decided, yes, that is fair use. If you're searching for a book that, literally 5 people have ever heard of, and Google happens to have scanned it and you're able to find it, that has public value. That's a service that Google's providing. And Google points out that Google News does not have any advertising. So they don't directly monetize those pieces of content. They just hope that people who go for Google News wind up doing other things or sticking around and looking at some ads.
I think it's bringing them into the ecosystem, right, and just kind of keeping them there because they monetize from everything else.
Yeah.
That's interesting, right? But because from what I can see as consumers, we're not actually that impacted unless, for example, like Facebook did, they block all the news channels, right? But now that everything's people have kind of backed down and they're changing the law, and the news outlets are back on Facebook, and Google has always had that. Are we affected in any way, like the average guy on the street? Person.
I think so. Like many things that involve massive, mega corporations and the government, you're probably not affected immediately, and you may not notice immediately, but these changes will have an impact over time. And what that impact will be is often difficult to say in the short term. It becomes obvious later, after it's too late to change it. So you could argue that these payments will entrench the existing monopolies of Google and Facebook. So then is that a good thing? Maybe not. Some people would argue not. It's also probably going to entrench the kind of quasi-monopolies that people like Rupert Murdoch have over the media, and that will have an impact over the long term. So is that a good idea? Lots of people would argue probably not. So I think we have to think about not just whether these moves can be justified in the moment, but what are the potential long-term impacts of them, which theoretically is what governments are supposed to think about, except they often don't.
That's true. And I think
this is the reason why I drink alcohol.
I think the one thing that we learned from it is monopolies aren't the best thing in the world. Probably definitely not in media sense and not in the giant internet company sense too. Sorry, Dave. Yeah, that's true. I mean, that kind of takes us down a different path, I guess. Dave, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
There's an interesting theory. There's an interesting theory about Google that they are what some people call a natural monopoly. That in order to have a search engine that indexes all the internet content, you effectively have to have a monopoly. It's impossible to do that. You can't have 800 different internet search engines that all do that. Anyway, that's different.
Did Peter Thiel invest in Google?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay, because I read his book 0 to 1, and he's really pro monopoly. He really encourages. Yeah, yeah.
A lot
Oh,
of rich guys are very pro monopoly.
yeah. Peter Thiel is very much into we're gonna take everything and just like squeeze every last drop from it. Yeah.
I think he read Ayn Rand and he just memorized it, and
He does recommend that book. I think it's him who recommend. There's a business person who really
probably,
recommends
yeah.
it.
A lot of business
Sure.
people recommend Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
So do you think mega corporations, right? There's a huge kind of movement against them. Like, do you think governments should have a say on how companies like Google and Facebook impact the countries they're in? Like, should they break these companies apart? Are they too big? Because I think some of the they just have more money than certain countries already, right? So are they too big? Should they be broken up?
I mean, that's a great question, and it kind of depends on what you think governments are for. And so, if you're Peter Thiel and others like him, governments are things that get in your way and prevent you from making as much money as you possibly can. And so, but if you think about how do we protect the things that matter for society? Obviously, information is one of those things. Are you getting enough? Are you getting the right kind? We've seen what disinformation can do, and I think there's a natural desire to. It's a little like pollution, if you will. I'm having a discussion with an expert in disinformation, and her way of thinking about it is like it's pollution. It's like Google and Facebook are oil companies, and yes, they're providing service, and we all use their gasoline, and it's great. You get to drive your giant truck wherever you want, but meanwhile, they're polluting the oceans, and eventually that's going to cause problems. And so, should we, as a society, be able to say no? You can't do that. Yes, probably. So the question is, how do we define the part that they're to blame for versus the part that we're to blame for? I mean, we're to blame because we use their services in a way. So we're emitting disinformation sometimes. We're kind of contributing to that pollution, if you will. And so what part of it is Google and Facebook's fault? And is that part of the reason why they're doing that they're giant companies and they're anti-competitive? And should we solve that with antitrust or by breaking them up? Or is that just going to make the problem worse because there's going to be, 1,000 small oil companies polluting everywhere instead of a couple of big ones? There are academics, that's literally all they study.
Yeah.
I think that's a very, very deep issue that is terrifying to consider. But just touching on that, wasn't Google slapped with an antitrust suit in the EU, which they lost?
Yeah.
It's like 4 billion fine or something, right? And
they've lost a couple of antitrust actions in the EU, and there are, I think we're getting up to like a half a dozen lawsuits in the US from various states, from the FTC. And so it's going to be interesting to watch those continue. The biggest problem the EU's had and other countries is you can fine Google and Facebook $4 billion, and a couple of months later they're like, well, paid for that. So it's very difficult to fine those companies enough. It's like you pull Elon Musk over and give him a speeding ticket. Unless that speeding ticket is $800 million, he's probably not going to even notice. So what is the incentive to him to not speed? There isn't any, really. And so what's the incentive for Google and Facebook to not do certain things? That none of these sort of judgments can touch them in financial terms.
Actually, I kind of wanted to talk to you because I know we're on the Google and Facebook thing, right? But I think we're also going into kind of we've been going into the new age of media, right? Do you see anything like kind of maybe like a new format that's going to just kind of take over from the traditional guys, because like you said, the newspapers were losing a readership, and then everything's going to digital, everything's online. But like, what about things like podcasts, like what you're on right now? Do you see any potential in that at all, to like become something that's mainstream, really mainstream?
I think you guys have a lot of potential.
Oh,
all right, that's it. We're not gonna. That's all we need.
I'm gonna tell my mom that.
That's going on the website. That's going on the website, guys. That's all we need.
It's made my midnight. Thank you.
It's a tough question though, because, and believe me, I've given it a lot of thought over the last 20 years since I started working on the internet. We know what existed before. We know the things that are dying now. And we know that there's kind of this cloud of other stuff, right? There's not just podcasts, but TikTok and Snapchat and Clubhouse and stuff like that. And are these going to be new media ecosystems or new media players? Are they going to give birth to new things that will become like newspapers or radio or TV? Probably, maybe, but we don't know which ones. We don't know. It's impossible to tell during a period like this. It's just literally chaos. So it's like predicting the weather. You can, in some cases, make predictions that are pretty good in the kind of short term, but the longer term you look at, less valuable your predictions are. So when Twitter first came along, I thought it was the dumbest thing I'd ever heard of. It had a dumb name. It made you feel like an idiot. You're like, I'm tweeting, and other people are like, you sound like a 5-year-old. Like, why are you even interested in this thing? And so it was a toy. And in fact, Clay Christensen has a theory that every big new transformative thing initially looks like a toy. So people dismiss it. They're like, this is ridiculous. Why would anybody do this? And then the next phase is everyone criticizes it because it's ruining society. So if you look at even books at one point, people were like, books, people spend all their time reading these things. They're full of garbage. The church can't push its message anymore. People are going to hell. And so that kind of plays out every time there's a new technology. Yeah. So, and in fact, in a way, the more criticism there is, the more likely it is that that thing is actually going to be important. So is Twitter a media entity? I think so. Is Facebook a media entity? For sure. And I don't think anyone would have predicted even, well, maybe 5 years ago, but 10 years ago, that this thing where you share photos of your cat or whatever run by this guy who's in his 20s is going to become the largest media entity that humanity has ever seen, is going to have 3 billion users. And it's just incomprehensible. And so, I think we're kind of in a position where we're trying to make sense of what is happening. There is no obvious replacement for, newspapers are going to become these things and radio is going to become like this. Podcasts have been around a long time, and they went through the sort of toy phase where people were thinking, oh, that's great, but who cares? A couple of guys in their mom's basement or whatever are talking about, is that a real phenomenon? And it isn't until the hard thing with internet-based stuff is it's impossible to tell until you get a critical mass of people doing it. And then you can start to see the shape of new things happening.
Maybe I shouldn't make fun of Clubhouse then, because I think it's really stupid. And maybe
I do too.
I better start investing it then. So the key is to find something that's stupid and people hate. Put money into it.
And every time I think something like that about Clubhouse, I'm reminded of what I thought about Twitter, and I check myself a little bit and think,
now you're an influencer on Twitter. You're a big name on Twitter now.
That should just be a pin tweet, like Twitter is stupid. Tweeting is stupid.
And I mean, I think about Clubhouse like, what if people thought, podcasts are too organized? What we should have is just rooms where people shout at each other and there's absolutely no organization. That sounds like a great idea. So like Twitter, except everybody's yelling at you.
It's like when I go to Tung's place, it's just yelling and fighting and drinking.
It doesn't sound like fun, but lots of people think it has value. So who am I to question them?
Yeah, I mean, we could do an entire episode about Clubhouse and how much I hate it. So I don't think we should go down that path because it's just going to get really personal about people who use Clubhouse. So I better not do that. Yeah, sorry, Dave, Cameron.
Yeah, we're mindful of your time, Matthew, but I'll just do another last quick question. In your gut, like if you're a gambling person, what technology or what platform do you think will you put your money on? Let's say, yeah, what does your gut say?
Well, the problem is my gut says multiple things at the same time, and many of them are, mutually exclusive. But I think there's two things I'm reminded of. I'm trying to remember who said it, but so there are two ways of making money. One is bundling, and one is unbundling. So you can, and I would sort of translate that a bit. I would invest either in the open web or an incredibly closed ecosystem. So Facebook is doing its best to be as closed as possible, which is, and it's ironic that people are saying Facebook is defending the open web because Facebook hates the open web. Facebook would much rather the web didn't exist. It wants to replace the internet and be as closed as possible. It didn't, at one point, it's changed a bit now, but at one point it didn't even like people to link to things. So it tried to disguise sort of open web links. That's one model for success. Facebook has, is one of the most successful startups probably ever in history. But I would argue the other model for success is to be as open as possible. And I don't have a good example of how that works except Wikipedia, which is the one that everybody points to. But that I'm a big fan of the open web for obvious reasons, but I do think that you can generate a surprising amount of sort of social capital. Whether you can turn that into real capital or not is a different question. It's harder to monetize, I think, the open web than a closed ecosystem. So it depends on kind of what you're after. Are you after kind of influence and social value, or are you after money?
So Dave's after money. I think we've confirmed that. No, but that's interesting, right? Because
no comment.
Do you think in that sense, then we're looking at if we were to do an open web project or invest in the open web, right, through whatever entity or platform that we identify, it's the same thing. Once you reach critical mass, then basically anything you do is going to start generating revenue, even if it's small amounts. At such volumes, it'll be a lot of money, I think, at that point.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And the perfect example is Craigslist, right?
Yeah.
I know Craig Newmark a little bit. He's a fascinating guy. He did not set out to create this massive, giga billion-dollar industry. He had no intention of creating a business at all.
Yeah, look at the design of the website. It hasn't changed at all since. Yeah.
Right. He did it by accident. So he accidentally created something at exactly the right time that had a huge amount of value. And then other people kind of took it and turned it into something, and it became this massive entity. But that wasn't why it started. And in fact, it wasn't even why it got as big as it did. I remember talking to Jim Buckmaster, the CEO, who came to a conference that I helped put together. And he said he was at a Wall Street investment thing. And they were like, Jim, you got this thing. You're like the 6th largest website on the internet. All you have to do is this was before they had added charges for certain types of ads and were making hundreds of millions of dollars a week. And they said, look, just put it like an ad on every other page and you'll be making $1 billion tomorrow morning. And Jim said, yeah, we're not going to do that. We don't like ads. Our users don't like ads. We're already making a fair bit of money. At that point, they were 20 some people in a house in San Francisco, 6th biggest website in the world. So, their point of view was, look, you got to monetize this thing. You could be making millions of dollars. And Jim's viewpoint was, we're doing okay. Me and Craig are doing all right and, providing this thing. So I think it's fascinating to look at examples like that. Even Twitter, I don't think wanted to create this multi-billion-dollar company. They were just a bunch of guys who were doing something cool, and then eventually people grabbed it and made it do all these other things that they never even thought of. So those are the ones that interest me.
So it's kind of like the guy who's in the club who tries really hard, doesn't get some. That's me. That's probably why I'm lacking so much in life at the moment, because I try really hard. Oh well. This conversation is really interesting. It's also made me very jaded, very cynical about.
Sorry about that.
No, don't apologize to Matthew. He's always like that. He just gets really cynical about things.
No, but it's a huge hype, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think it's been one of the best conversations I've had this year. I really enjoy it. So thanks,
Great.
Matthew.
No, thanks for having me. I enjoy talking about it, as you can tell.
Did you have any other questions, Tung? Sorry.
No, I think we covered everything, man. This gave me a lot to think about, mostly about how useless everything is and how yeah, basically.
Right, we'll keep drinking after this time.
Yeah. Maybe tomorrow morning it'll see that.
So Matthew, if anyone else wanted to follow more of your work, see what you're up to, where's the best place to go?
Probably Twitter. I'm not on TikTok, and I'm not on Clubhouse. So yeah,
not yet.
Twitter.
Not yet.
Or Columbia Journalism Review, which is cjr.org.
Awesome. And we'll have links to them on the show notes. But if you're on Twitter right now, Matthew's at MATHEWI. Yeah, that was great. I really appreciate your time, Matthew. It's been an honor, and it was such a good conversation. So I'll be sharing this to everyone I know.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. I enjoyed it. Thanks for all the great questions. These are big topics. We could probably do a whole series on each one.
Yeah, for sure.
And so for anyone else, thanks so much for listening. We really love your support, guys. So feel free to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or your favorite podcast listener. Don't forget to like and subscribe and comment. So thanks so much, guys. For the show notes of this episode, check out businessoverdrinks.com.
And thanks to Liquor Loot for sponsoring us. And they're helping us make sure that more episodes keep on coming out.
So feel free to click through their website. It is a great product. And we're not just saying that because they're a sponsor. It is a really good product. So thanks, guys.